If you've made it through high school English here in the United States, then there's a good chance you've read the poem Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Written by Dylan Thomas in 1947, its speaker encourages those near death to rage against the dying of the light, because old age should burn and rave at close of day. In my teenage years, I remember being asked to compare this theme, this idea that one should fight back against the flow of time to the bitter end, to any number of works, from Shakespeare's King Lear to Disney's Up and everything in between. But I sure wish Dark Souls had been around back in the late 2000s, because if you ask me, no character in fiction better exemplifies this flawed philosophy or its natural endpoint better than Gwyn, the game's final boss. Many have drawn attention to just how appropriately the poem sums up the Lord of Cinder, from fantastic Reddit posts to the illustrious VaatiVidya. Here, I intend to continue that conversation by using Dylan Thomas's work as a lens through which to analyze Gwyn's behavior and beliefs, and compare his downfall and decline to a real-life group of people. Through Gwyn, Dark Souls shows us why someone would go to such extreme lengths to rage against the dying of the light, the heartbreaking realities of attempting to do so, and incorporates all of this into the larger themes of its universe. But before I go on, if you are a Dark Souls fan, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me with the YouTube channel membership or over on Patreon. My dream is to make these videos full-time someday, and by doing any of those things, you'll be helping make that dream a reality. We hear about Gwyn for the first time in the intro to Dark Souls 1, during one of From Software's signature Noun Soup opening cutscenes. Here, he's described as the Lord of Sunlight, who discovered one of the all-powerful Lord Souls and waged war against the ancient dragons, tearing apart their stone scales with his mighty thunderbolts. His appearance, coupled with his mastery of lightning, brings to mind Zeus, king of the Olympian gods from Greek mythology. It's an apt comparison for reasons we'll dive into later. It's something that isn't talked about enough amidst scouring item descriptions for lore and the discussions around the difficulty of the Soulsborne series. But one of Miyazaki and Company's greatest strengths is taking immediately recognizable aspects of real-world culture, in this case Zeus, and remixing them into a form that suits their story and the priorities of their game design while still retaining what made them so familiar in the first place. Quite a bit of time passes before the player hears about Gwyn again, as they scrape and crawl their way through the early game bosses of Lordran. When they do find out more about him, it's from one of the primordial serpents, either Frampt or Cath. Though they differ on what should take place after the deed is done, with Frampt advocating for a new Age of Fire and Cath for an Age of Dark, the one thing they both agree on is that Gwyn needs to go. For too long, he has raged against the dying of the light, and now it's up to us to either replace him by linking the First Flame, or leave the embers to fade away and become the Lord of Dark. The reasons for Gwyn refusing to go gently are better explained by Cath than Frampt. The Age of Fire was always destined to end eventually, to be replaced by an Age of Dark, where men, not gods, would reign supreme. Gwyn obviously fears this. He fears the rise of the humans and the downfall of the gods, the demise of his legacy, the end of all he created. His prejudice aside, the rest of Gwyn's feelings are only natural. It's normal for us to cling to the end of an era in our lives, to do whatever it takes to prolong it, whether it be our youth, our careers, or even a romantic relationship. By linking the First Flame, Gwyn has halted the natural progression of the universe. An Age of Fire is supposed to be followed by an Age of Dark, for old things to die off and new things to rise up from their ashes. This cycle isn't made explicitly clear until Dark Souls 3, perhaps 2 if you read between the lines enough, but that really is the way it's supposed to be. Nothing lasts forever, not even the time of the gods. All of this sets up Gwyn as someone who not only looks like Zeus, or has some of the same abilities as him, but is a character who is, essentially, engaging in an adapted version of the story of Prometheus. Rather than punishing a titan who stole fire and gave it to the humans, as Zeus does, he is protecting the flame himself to ensure that their time never comes. Again, it's a manipulation of mythology. The players and imagery are similar to what we're familiar with, enough for us to identify them and for it to tap into our cultural consciousness, but the specifics are quite different. But in any case, even adherents of the Age of Fire, like Frampt, believe that something needs to change. So whether or not you side with him or Kath, seek to prolong this age or usher in the time of men, your mission is the same: to kill all of Gwyn's buddies until you are, at last, ready to face the sad old man at the center of all this. Still, nothing either of the serpents tell the chosen undead prepares the player for what they'll find waiting for them at the end of the game. After gathering the Lord Souls, the Lord Vessel will open the path to the kiln of the first flame. There, you'll find Gwyn, a shadow of his former self, desperately clinging to the fire, and by extension, his age. FromSoft has made a lot of great games since Dark Souls 1, and given us plenty of incredible boss fights. But in terms of pure presentation, there's no doubt in my mind that this one is their very best. Everything, from the fading light of the arena, to Gwyn's disheveled appearance, and of course, the heartbreaking music, make it clear that this is not a moment to be proud of. This duel with the very first Lord of Cinder might be the culmination of our journey, but it's less an epic battle with the King of the Gods at the height of his power, and more the eviction of a stubborn grandpa who's refusing to give up his house and move into a retirement home. He is, quite literally, raging against the dying of the light. Perhaps the worst thing about Gwyn's refusal to go gentle is the futility of it all. If you defeat Gwyn and link the first flame in Dark Souls 1, then the chosen undead is engulfed in an epic explosion, prolonging the Age of Fire for the second time. But by the end of Dark Souls 3, after everyone from the puny Ludleth of Courland to the depraved Aldrich has followed in your footsteps, if the unkindled one chooses to link the fire, there's no bombastic eruption of flame, just a sad, puny ember that's only strong enough to set the protagonist ablaze. I wish I'd been around when Dark Souls 1 came out, because I'd have loved to have joined in on the discussion about which ending was more appropriate. I'm sure that the Age of Dark ending would have been seen as the bad ending, and Age of Fire as the good one. But all these years later, having seen the way things end up in Dark Souls 3, and with the clarity that an Age of Dark is the natural response to an Age of Fire, I'm not so sure that's the case anymore. Perhaps Age of Dark is the more narratively appropriate one, because by the time Dark Souls 3 rolls around, the Age of Fire is as tired as Gwyn is at the end of Dark Souls 1. Just as he needs to be replaced, so too does the era he started, an era that has been prolonged over and over again until the first flame quite literally burns you gently. Thus, the futility of resisting the natural flow of time isn't just a part of Gwyn's character arc, it's a key theme of the Dark Souls universe at large. Raging against the dying of the light is a depressing, sorrowful sight, because it always is. As poignant and as beloved as Dylan Thomas's poem might be, the reality is that watching someone refuse to go gentle into that good night is usually a gut-wrenching experience. Whenever I get to the end of Dark Souls 1 and see the sad monstrosity that Gwyn has become, I think of professional athletes at the end of their careers. Men and women who once held audiences in the palms of their hands, but almost overnight fell from grace and became just as mortal as the rest of us. Growing up in Philadelphia, one of my favorites was Donovan McNabb, who quarterbacked my beloved Philadelphia Eagles for 11 seasons. During that time, he was one of the most dominant players in the league and regularly led the Birds on deep runs into the playoffs. But by 2010, the team saw the writing on the wall, saw that he was declining, that it was time for a new champion to link the fire, and traded him to the Washington Commanders. I wanted to cheer for him, to root for his success, but within weeks, it was clear that he, just like Gwyn, was but a shadow of his former self. In a game against the Detroit Lions, with his team down just 6 points with less than 2 minutes to go, his coach benched him for Rex Grossman, who was about as good of a quarterback as Pinwheel is a boss, citing McNabb's, quote, cardiovascular endurance, which is coach speak for saying he was out of shape. And as the season wore on, announcers drew attention to his poor performance. One of the best things about McNabb's game was his ability to escape defenders in the pocket, to make them miss and still deliver his passes. But in Washington, his speed and elusiveness took a nosedive, to the point where even average defensive linemen were wrapping him up as though he were a mere hollow. By December, McNabb would be permanently supplanted by the aforementioned Grossman, and while many players might have taken this as a hint that it was time to call it a career, number 5 did not. Like Gwyn, he raged against the dying of the light and refused to go gentle. For McNabb, linking the fire one more time meant going to the Minnesota Vikings, where in his first game with the team, he threw for just 35 yards. To the uninitiated, that's about as pathetic as firing up Dark Souls 1, getting wrecked by the Asylum Demon, and giving up right there. McNabb rebounded somewhat, putting up decent numbers in the games that followed, but the team, like Lordran, was rotting around him. After a 1-5 start to the season, McNabb was again benched, this time in favor of rookie Christian Ponder. McNabb asked to be released from the Vikings, a request the team granted. Though he hoped to sign with a quarterback-needy team, such as the Kansas City Chiefs, the Houston Texans, or his hometown Chicago Bears, they turned him down for guys like Jake Delhomme, Kyle Orton, and Josh McCown, none of whom could have held a candle to McNabb back in his heyday. Father Time had, as it always does, come for McNabb, and it would mark the end of his career, no matter how much he tried to rave and burn at close of day. Pro athletes always want to go out at the top of their game, to end their careers like Peyton Manning or John Elway, both of whom retired after winning a Super Bowl. But far more often, as shown by the story of Donovan McNabb, they end up like Gwyn. Sad old men, raging against the dying of the light and refusing to go gentle as guys who couldn't lace their boots back in the day, whether it's an average defensive tackle or a random undead murder hobo, finish off their careers in unceremonious fashion. And that's what makes Gwyn so important to Dark Souls. So often, we try to romanticize the end of an age, the end of a career, the end of a life. But Miyazaki and company are bold enough to show us the truth. That trying to arrest the natural cycles of the universe has dire consequences for us and all of those around us. Perhaps, at close of day, what is right is to go gently into that good night, and to embrace the dying of the light. Thanks for watching. Big thanks to Alex Roe for allowing all of us YouTubers to use his awesome Dark Souls remixes for our videos. Huge shout out to my Silver and Gold tier channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Raven Lampkin, Corey Matson, Lil Caesar, Reed, and Pathonian, who receive early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time.